So, you've been running your Dungeons and Dragons campaign for a few sessions now. You have a big bad evil guy planned, and the players are off on their first major adventure. However, your last session was a little rough towards the finish, and you had to roll some major acrobatics checks to herd those cats to the end that you had spent several hours planning the week before. But what if I told you that you don't need to spend hours prepping for D&D, that your players may even like it better that way? Today, I'm going to show you some of the writing tools that I use to plan my games and how to give both your players and the villain more agency. First, we're going to need to decide what style of story we're telling. Is your game more episodic with the players solving a new problem every session or two before resetting back to zero, ready for the next, or is it more serialized, akin to a sweeping epic where things that happened at level 1 are still relevant at level 14? Just having an answer for this question makes prepping your game much easier. If you find yourself running an episodic adventure, there's an excellent style of writing created by John Four of roleplayingtips.com called the 5 Room Dungeon that works great. It looks like this. This format was originally designed to create short dungeons that could be built and played in a few hours each, but fewer and fewer Dungeons and Dragons games have dungeons or dragons in them. There are far more tables ridding Barovia of the undead or traversing the Astral Sea in a Spelljammer than there are on floor 17 of Ender Mountain. And that's before taking into account the myriad of homebrew games out there that are sailing pirate ships, patrolling cities, and hunting kaiju. But just because it says dungeon on the label doesn't mean that it only works underground. If instead of rooms we just call them challenges, we can adapt the 5 room dungeon to any kind of episodic adventure that we want. For challenge 1, we need to do two things: establish the problem and why only the players can solve it. The original design, this is a gatekeeper of some kind, but as long as it's a barrier that is just high enough to need the heroes to solve, it fits this role. A few examples I've personally used are: players need to investigate before continuing the adventure. An enemy attacks the party, seemingly unprovoked, or a customer or quest giver approaches the party with a job, but may not be forthcoming with all the details. Once the party has unlocked the adventure, they move on to challenge 2, a puzzle or roleplay challenge. Now, if you use a puzzle or social encounter for the first challenge, you may want to run some kind of combat here instead. Players like to clicky clack the math rocks. Challenge 3 is a setback of some kind. Around halfway into the session, you want there to be something that disrupts the party. Maybe the players were lied to, or the villain gets one up on them and advances their plans unexpectedly. This serves to refocus the party and make the adventure feel like there is a back and forth between them and the bad guys. Two examples are: an NPC previously thought to be an ally is actually working for the villain. The party falls into a trap of some kind, or maybe the bad guys achieve their goal early and now the party's mission is vengeance rather than prevention. Challenge 4 is the climax. The party catches up with the villain of the week and brings them to justice. Save your best material for this part. It can be any kind of encounter you can think of, like maybe a show-stopping combat encounter, or thrilling philosophical debate, or maybe high-stakes riddle contest. After that, the adventure is done and the party collects their loot and XP, which makes Challenge 5 deciding what to do next. Use this to help tie the episodes together and collect player input for the next session. Now, if you're running a serialized campaign where it can take months for a plot to resolve, things get a bit more complicated. I like to use a classic 3-act structure for my sessions. I decide what part of the story we will be playing through this week and split it into 3 parts: the beginning, middle, and end. Then, each of those 3 parts, I split it again: beginning of the beginning, the middle of the beginning, and the end of the beginning, and so on and so on. I play 3-hour sessions, so I try to split the time evenly between those 3 acts. Also, Dungeons and Dragons is split into 3 pillars of play: combat, exploration, and roleplay, so I try to have an act focus on one of those each as well. The order doesn't particularly matter. This style takes a bit longer to prep than the 5 room dungeon, but if you're playing a serialized game, lots of writing is what you signed up for. This brings us to efficient prep time. Having a good framework for how we structure our sessions makes planning them quicker, since it's filling out a form at that point. But I have a trick I use to make it even quicker. I call it the pendulum of agency, and it saves me at least an hour of prep time a week. The concept works like this. At the start of the game, you, the dungeon master, should have all the agency. You decide the scenario the players find themselves in, what stage the villain's plot is at, and have at least one combat encounter planned. In my 3-hour sessions, the first hour is entirely mine. Around the midpoint is where the players should be breaking free, disrupting your plots, and should be starting to direct how they resolve the current conflict. By the end of the session, you've thrown your notes in the trash, the players have stolen a cow, started their own sub-shop, and given Acerich one hell of a noogie. This style of play not only lets your players choose the direction of the game, but also lets you pivot during your prep time instead of in the first 30 minutes of a session. My notes also look something like this: the bulk of my planning for when the pendulum is on my side, and only a vague idea of what I'd like to have happen while I have control. This style of play does rely somewhat on your ability to improvise, should the players have a wild idea that they want to try, but planning to improvise later on, while also having a firm set of guide rails for the first third of the game, much less stressful than having to toss an hour's worth of prep or forcing your players down a certain path when they have other things they want to do. In the 5 room dungeon style, this method is baked right in. Challenge 5 is the players deciding what to do next, and then you run off and plan the next session based on that. With the 3 act framework, this is where we really shave some time off. Most games don't have the time for more than 1 or 2 combat encounters, and if you're devoting each act to one of the pillars of the game, try to keep combat in one of the first 2 while you still hold agency. I put the most work into the first act, setting up the main goal of the session. I then try to plan the climax for around the end of the second act, just as I've let go of the reins. The players are then free to choose their path from there. Normally, I have an idea of some kind of social exploration encounter for the third act, but I don't spend much time fleshing it out, as there's a good chance the players may take the game in a very different direction. For my game, I mostly use the 3 act method, but whenever my party is between major chapters, I'll use the 5 room dungeon to flesh out some side plots, or set up foreshadowing for later. With all that in mind, this is how my prep usually goes. First, I set a goal for what I want to have happen. Typically, I have a specific scene in mind or a combat I want to run. I then decide if it's going to be a 5 room or a 3 act session. If it's a 5 room, I fill out my checklist and plan the combat encounters, and my prep is done. If it's a 3 act, I make a quick outline of 1 sentence for each act and then another sentence for each part of each act. From there, it's again finishing the checklist. I script out my first act, plan my climax encounter for the end of Act 2, and then rely on my 1 sentence notes for Act 3. When all is said and done, I've spent about an hour and a half to prep my game, including finding or making a map for combat. Having an established framework to plan your sessions helps optimize your prep time and makes the quality of your games more consistent. And having the agency of the story be something that you pass between you and your players allows them to feel in control of their story while allowing you time to properly plan for how the world reacts to their actions, and leaves half the writing for them to do. I livestream my game prep every Sunday on twitch.tv, and you can join my Discord for a free copy of my campaign setting, Bastion, City of Walls. Links below the video. Thanks for watching.